Picture this: Paris, April 1943, and 31-year-old Odette Sansom sits in a Gestapo interrogation room at 84 Avenue Foch, her fingernails having been torn out one by one over the previous 6 hours. Yet she maintains the cover story that's keeping her colleagues alive, that she's married to a British officer, rather than being herself the radio operator who's been coordinating resistance networks across occupied France for 18 months. The pain is excruciating, but what's destroying her psychologically isn't the physical torture. It's the knowledge that if she breaks, 14 people will die, that their trust in her is the only thing protecting them, and that maintaining that trust requires her to endure suffering, that's pushing her mind toward places from which she might not return. This is the hidden cost of espionage during World War II, not the glamorous danger of spy novels, but the psychological annihilation that came from living lies so completely that your real self dissolved, from making life-and-death decisions with insufficient information and living forever with the consequences, from trusting nobody and being trusted by everyone, and from the impossibility of ever fully returning to normal life after spending years in a state of hypervigilance where one mistake, one slip in your cover, one moment of authentic emotion could mean not just your death but the death of everyone depending on you. Between 1939 and 1945, approximately 16,000 agents worked for British intelligence services alone, operating behind enemy lines in occupied Europe, infiltrating Nazi organizations, coordinating resistance movements, and gathering intelligence that shaped military strategy. Of those 16,000, over 400 were women, defying gender norms to become some of the war's most effective operatives, precisely because Nazi security services didn't expect women to be spies and therefore scrutinized them less carefully. The numbers tell part of the story, but miss the psychological complexity. Of the approximately 500 Special Operations Executive agents deployed to occupied France, 118 died, captured, tortured, and executed, while the survivors returned to Britain after the war with psychological damage that 1940s medicine had no framework to understand or treat. What we now recognize as PTSD, complex trauma, dissociative disorders, and moral injury manifested in depression, alcoholism, failed relationships, and in far too many cases, suicide. Odette Sansom herself, who survived Ravensbrück concentration camp and received the George Cross for her courage, later described the post-war years as harder than the war itself, because during the war, she'd had a purpose that made the suffering meaningful, while after the war she had memories that wouldn't leave her alone, and a self she could no longer recognize. The question that haunts espionage history, that haunted the agents themselves, and that continues to haunt their descendants, is whether the intelligence gained justified the psychological destruction of the people who gathered it, whether nations have obligations to operatives who sacrificed not just years but their very identities for national security, and whether we can celebrate their courage without romanticizing trauma that many of them never overcame. How do you live after years of being someone you're not? How do you maintain relationships when you've learned that trust is a weapon to be exploited and that emotional vulnerability is a security risk? How do you process experiences you can never discuss because they're classified, and because the people you love could never understand what you did or why you did it? These questions define the invisible scars of espionage, wounds that don't show on the body, but that shape everything about how survivors move through the world, relate to others, and make sense of their own histories. The technology of World War II espionage, the codes and ciphers, the hidden radios, the false documents, has been extensively documented, but the psychological technology that made espionage possible, the mental techniques for maintaining cover, for resisting interrogation, for killing when necessary, for compartmentalizing trauma to remain functional, remains less understood because much of it was never formally documented, developed through trial and error by agents who learned what worked, through surviving, and what didn't work through dying. To understand the psychological landscape of World War II espionage, we must first understand the world that created the need for these shadow warriors, a 1930s Europe where rising fascism, failed appeasement, and the recognition that another war was coming created demand for intelligence capabilities that Britain's traditional military intelligence couldn't provide. The British intelligence establishment in the 1930s was dominated by the Secret Intelligence Service, commonly known as MI6, which focused on gathering intelligence through traditional means. signals, intercepts, diplomatic sources, and networks of informants who provided information for money or ideology. This approach worked adequately in peacetime, but had critical limitations when war came. MI6's networks in occupied Europe were quickly compromised by Nazi security services. Its agents were often elderly and unsuited for the physical demands of wartime operations, and its culture emphasized caution and bureaucracy over the aggressive risk-taking that occupied territories required. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May 1940 after France fell and Britain faced invasion threat, recognized these limitations and demanded a new organization that could set Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and coordinated resistance. The Special Operations Executive was established in July 1940 with this mandate, drawing personnel from military intelligence, from industry, from academia, and from the pool of European refugees who'd fled Nazi-occupied countries and who had language skills, cultural knowledge, and motivation that British-born agents couldn't match. The SOE's approach was revolutionary, not just in its willingness to use irregular warfare tactics, but in its recognition that successful espionage required psychological sophistication, understanding how to select agents with the right temperament, how to train them to maintain cover under extreme stress, how to prepare them for the isolation and moral ambiguity they'd face, and how to debrief them after operations that traumatized in ways that conventional military service didn't. The challenge was that in 1940, there was no established body of knowledge about the psychology of espionage, no proven training methods, and no understanding of what psychological qualities predicted success versus breakdown. The SOE had to develop this knowledge through trial and error, learning from agents who succeeded and died, from those who broke under interrogation, and from the rare survivors who returned to describe what they'd endured. Odette Sansom, whose torture in Paris opened this story, represents the type of person the SOE recruited and the psychological journey they underwent. Born Odette Braley in 1912 in Amiens, France, she was thoroughly French, but had married an Englishman and moved to Britain in 1931, giving her dual cultural identity that would prove crucial for her later work. When war began, she was a housewife with 3 young daughters, living in Somerset with no apparent qualifications for espionage beyond speaking fluent French and having personal knowledge of France that would allow her to blend in naturally. What she also possessed, though SOE assessors wouldn't recognize it until later, was a particular psychological architecture shaped by childhood trauma and hardship that had created extraordinary resilience, combined with a kind of dissociative flexibility that made compartmentalization easier for her than for people whose selves were more integrated and stable. She'd lost her father at age 18, had survived polio as a child that left her partially blind for several years, and had developed what psychologists would now recognize as a form of defensive detachment where she could separate emotional experience from immediate response, allowing her to endure suffering without immediate breakdown while storing the trauma for later processing that might never come. The SOE recruited Odette in 1942 after she responded to an Admiralty request for photographs of the French coast. She'd sent some family photos thinking she was helping with coastal intelligence, but the SOE saw her letter as evidence of someone with French knowledge and British loyalty and approached her about more direct service. The recruitment interview process was designed to assess not just language skills and knowledge, but psychological suitability for the impossible demands of espionage work. Assessors looked for resilience, for ability to think quickly under pressure, for comfort with moral ambiguity, for capacity to lie convincingly and critically, for what they called operational loneliness tolerance, the ability to function effectively while completely isolated from support structures, knowing that capture meant torture and likely death, and that calling for help would endanger everyone in the network. The assessment was imperfect. There was no way to truly test how someone would respond to Gestapo interrogation without actually torturing them, no way to determine whether someone could maintain cover for months or years without actually deploying them. But the SOE developed a training program at various sites across Britain that attempted to prepare agents for what they'd face. The training Odette and other SOE agents underwent was comprehensive and psychologically sophisticated in ways that seem prescient, given that the field of psychology was still relatively primitive in the 1940s. At preliminary schools in Scotland, recruits learned basic tradecraft, codes and ciphers for secure communication, methods for detecting surveillance and evading pursuit, techniques for secure dead drops and meetings with contacts, and the fundamentals of cover stories and identity maintenance. But the training went beyond technical skills to address psychological preparation. Agents practiced maintaining cover, while instructors deliberately tried to break them through unexpected challenges designed to create stress and test responses. They learned meditation and self-hypnosis techniques that could help manage pain and fear during interrogation, and they received instruction in what we'd now call compartmentalization, creating mental boundaries between their authentic selves and their cover identities, so that even under torture they could maintain separation. The most psychologically demanding training came at Beaulieu in Hampshire, where agents spent weeks being subjected to mock Gestapo interrogations designed to prepare them for the real thing, while also allowing assessors to identify those likely to break. The ethical complexity of this training deserves attention because it involved deliberately traumatizing recruits in ways that some never fully recovered from, justified by the argument that training trauma was preferable to operational failure that would cause agent deaths. Mock interrogations included sleep deprivation, stress positions, psychological manipulation, where instructors exploited recruits' fears and insecurities, and in some cases physical violence that stopped just short of serious injury. The psychological justification was that experiencing these techniques in controlled settings would inoculate agents against breaking when facing the real thing, but the actual effect was often to traumatize recruits before they ever reached the field, creating baseline anxiety and hypervigilance that made them more effective operationally, but that also ensured they'd carry psychological damage regardless of whether they were captured. Some recruits broke during training and were reassigned to less sensitive duties, which was the desired outcome, better to identify psychological limits in Britain than in occupied France. But others learned to dissociate during interrogation, to separate their consciousness from their bodies in ways that allowed them to endure torture, but that also created dissociative patterns that persisted after the war ended. Odette's deployment to France in November 1942 illustrates the operational reality that training could never fully prepare for: the constant low-grade terror of living a lie, the exhaustion of maintaining hypervigilance, the moral complexity of decisions where every option carried risks and consequences that kept agents awake at night. She was deployed as a courier for a network called Spindle, operating in the Côte d'Azur region, coordinating sabotage operations and intelligence gathering. Her cover was that she was Odette Metayer, a widow whose husband had died early in the war, who was living with relatives and looking for work, a cover that allowed her to move relatively freely and to explain why she sometimes had to travel or had unexplained absences. The cover was plausible but fragile. Any investigation would reveal inconsistencies. Anyone who knew the real Odette Metayer could expose her, and maintaining the cover required constant vigilance about every detail of speech, behavior, and history. She had to remember not just her cover story, but hundreds of small details that made it convincing: where she'd gone to school, what her husband's favorite foods were, what church her family attended, the names of neighbors and shopkeepers, because any inability to answer a simple question could trigger suspicion. The psychological toll of this constant performance was profound and has been documented in post-war interviews with surviving agents who describe feeling that their authentic selves eroded over time, that the cover became more real than the person underneath, and that after months or years, they sometimes forgot who they really were. Odette later described experiencing what she called identity drift, where she'd catch herself thinking as Odette Metayer rather than Odette Sansom, adopting Metayer's supposed preferences and memories as if they were real, and sometimes feeling that Sansom was the imposture, while Metayer was authentic. This identity confusion served operational purposes. The more fully she inhabited the cover, the more convincingly she could maintain it, but it created psychological crisis about authenticity and selfhood that many agents struggled with for years after the war. The modern psychological literature on undercover police officers and intelligence operatives documents similar patterns. Prolonged deception erodes sense of stable identity, creates difficulty distinguishing between authentic and performed emotions, and can result in dissociative disorders, where the person literally cannot maintain integrated sense of self because they've spent too long being multiple contradictory people. The operational challenges Odette faced went beyond identity maintenance to include the constant moral calculations that espionage required, decisions about whom to trust, how much to reveal, whether to prioritize mission success over individual safety, and how to balance operational security against human compassion. In her role coordinating the Spindle network, she had to recruit French civilians to provide intelligence, shelter and support for sabotage operations, which meant putting those civilians at risk of Gestapo reprisals if the network was compromised. She had to make decisions about which targets were worth sabotaging versus which would trigger disproportionate German retaliation against French civilians. She had to evaluate whether agents showing signs of stress could continue operating or needed to be extracted before they broke and compromised the network. And she had to maintain relationships with her contacts that were simultaneously genuine, based on shared commitment to defeating Nazis, and instrumental, where she was fundamentally using people to achieve intelligence objectives. This dual nature of relationships created moral injury. She cared about the people she worked with and also saw them as operational assets, and reconciling those contradictory framings was psychologically corrosive. The crisis that led to Odette's capture in April 1943 involved exactly these moral complexities. Her network had been penetrated by a double agent who'd convinced other resistance members he was trustworthy, and Odette had to decide whether to trust him or to assume he was compromised. She chose wrong, trusting when she should have fled, and the result was that she and her colleague Peter Churchill were arrested by the Gestapo and taken to Paris for interrogation. The interrogation techniques used by the Gestapo were designed not just to extract information, but to break the psychological defenses that SOE training had attempted to build. Prolonged interrogation sessions that denied sleep and created disorientation, alternation between violent abuse and compassionate treatment, designed to create emotional dependency, exploitation of personal relationships and fears to find psychological pressure points, and escalating physical torture that ranged from beatings to specific techniques, like pulling fingernails that created excruciating pain without causing immediate death. Odette's resistance to this interrogation became legendary. She maintained her cover story that she was married to Peter Churchill, who she falsely claimed was related to Winston Churchill, and that she was merely his wife rather than the radio operator she actually was, drawing interrogation focus to herself and away from other network members whose identities she protected by never revealing them. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Odette to resist torture have been analyzed extensively by intelligence psychologists, trying to understand what makes some agents break while others endure. Her own descriptions emphasized dissociation. She described separating her consciousness from her body during torture, mentally removing herself to a psychological space where pain was happening to someone else, and focusing on memories of her daughters to maintain will to survive. Modern trauma research validates this description. Dissociation is a common defense mechanism during overwhelming trauma where consciousness literally separates from bodily experience as protective response. And while dissociation allows functioning during trauma, it also creates long-term psychological problems because the trauma isn't integrated into coherent memory, but instead remains fragmented and intrusive. Odette also describes a form of oppositional determination. The more her interrogators tried to break her, the more stubborn she became, transforming the interrogation into a contest of wills where surrendering felt like losing not just operationally, but existentially. This competitive framing allowed her to maintain resistance when compassionate framings, like protecting colleagues, might have eroded under torture's pressure. After months of interrogation during which she revealed nothing that compromised her network, Odette was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, where she spent 15 months in conditions designed to destroy prisoners psychologically and physically through starvation, disease, forced labor, arbitrary violence, and constant proximity to death. Ravensbrück held approximately 130,000 women during the war, of whom between 30 and 50,000 died, making it one of the deadliest camps in the Nazi system. For Odette, Ravensbrück represented a different form of trauma than interrogation. Instead of acute terror, it was chronic degradation, the daily erosion of humanity through conditions that reduced people to animals fighting for survival. She was held in solitary confinement for much of her imprisonment, which created different psychological challenges: isolation that removed all social support, sensory deprivation that created dissociation and time distortion, and the psychological burden of having nothing to do except think about the people she'd failed to protect, and the possible deaths that her capture might have caused. The combination of Gestapo torture, concentration camp imprisonment, and solitary confinement created layered trauma that would take decades to process, and that in many ways she never fully overcame. Odette's liberation in May 1945 came when American forces overran Ravensbrück, but liberation didn't bring immediate relief. It brought the beginning of confronting what she'd endured and trying to rebuild a self that had been systematically dismantled. She returned to Britain weighing 82 pounds, suffering from malnutrition, recurring nightmares, and what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD and complex trauma. The British government awarded her the George Cross, making her one of only 4 women to receive Britain's highest civilian gallantry award, but the recognition couldn't address the psychological damage or provide the treatment she needed because effective trauma treatment didn't exist in 1945. She was told essentially to be grateful she'd survived, to focus on rebuilding her life, and to try to forget what she couldn't forget. Her marriage to her pre-war husband had dissolved. They'd grown into different people during the war, and he couldn't understand what she'd experienced or why she couldn't simply return to being the housewife she'd been before. And she eventually married Peter Churchill, the SOE colleague she'd been captured with, in a relationship bound by shared trauma, but also complicated by the way that trauma had shaped both of them. Many SOE veterans married each other after the war, finding that only someone who'd endured similar experiences could understand the psychological aftermath. But these trauma-bonded relationships often struggled because both partners carried damage that made intimacy difficult. The broader story of SOE agents' psychological aftermath reveals patterns similar to Odette's across hundreds of survivors: difficulty readjusting to civilian life, broken relationships, substance abuse, depression, and in far too many cases, suicide. Virginia Hall, legendary American OSS agent who'd operated in France despite having a prosthetic leg, returned to Washington after the war and worked a desk job at CIA for decades, never receiving proper recognition because her wartime service remained classified, and suffering from what family members recognized as depression and isolation, rooted in having experiences she could never discuss and achievements she could never acknowledge. Francis Camertz, who'd run one of the largest SOE networks in southern France, returned to Britain and worked as a teacher, but struggled with survivor guilt about the agents and resistance members who died under his command, questioning decisions he'd made and wondering whether different choices would have saved lives. Many agents developed what psychologists now call moral injury, psychological distress from having participated in or witnessed actions that violated their moral values, distinct from PTSD's fear-based trauma, but equally debilitating. Espionage required lying, manipulating, sometimes killing, and always using people as means to ends. And while those actions were necessary and justified by war's context, they still violated agents' peacetime values in ways that created lasting psychological conflict. The resolution and legacy of World War II espionage's psychological costs continues to shape modern intelligence services' approaches to agent selection, training, support, and post-operational care, though the fundamental tension between operational effectiveness and operator well-being remains unresolved. Modern intelligence agencies have learned from WWII's mistakes. Agents receive more psychological screening before deployment, better training in stress management and resilience, and most importantly, access to psychological support during and after operations rather than being told to tough it out alone. But the core psychological challenges remain. Espionage still requires living lies that erode identity, still demands moral compromises that create injury, still isolates operators from support networks, and still creates experiences that can't be processed through normal mechanisms because they can't be discussed openly. The question of whether nations adequately compensate operatives for these psychological costs remains contentious. Odette and other SOE veterans received medals and pensions, but not the mental health care they needed, and modern intelligence operatives often report similar gaps between recognition and actual support. So what do we take from the story of Odette Sansom and the thousands of World War II spies whose silent dramas left invisible scars that shape the rest of their lives? First, that courage has costs that medals can't compensate, that the people we celebrate for extraordinary actions often carry burdens we don't see and struggle with, aftermath we don't acknowledge. Second, that identity is fragile when deliberately dismantled, that living lies for extended periods erodes sense of authentic self in ways that make peacetime adjustment difficult or impossible. Third, that moral injury from necessary but disturbing actions can be as psychologically damaging as fear-based trauma, that doing things that violate your values affects you even when you believe they were justified. Fourth, that institutions using people for dangerous work have obligations beyond operational success to provide genuine support rather than just recognition, that sending people into psychological danger requires preparing them for aftermath, not just for missions. And fifth, that the silence surrounding espionage compounds trauma because classified experiences can't be processed through normal social support, creating isolation that prevents healing. As we close this examination of espionage's psychological costs, consider what invisible scars might exist in your own family or community. People who served in ways they can't discuss, who carry burdens they can't share, who struggle with experiences that official histories don't acknowledge. Drop a comment if you have family members who worked in intelligence or whose wartime service remains mysterious. If you recognize these patterns of trauma in people you know, if this history helps make sense of behaviors or silences you've observed. If this story changed how you think about espionage, heroism, or the costs of secrets, hit that like button to help others discover that spy stories are less about excitement than about psychological destruction in service of national security. Subscribe for more examinations of World War II's hidden psychological costs, stories that honor not just what people did, but what those actions cost them. Click the bell for our next video examining how codebreakers at Bletchley Park carried their own invisible scars from knowing secrets that shaped history, but that they couldn't discuss for decades, another story of minds sacrificed for victory. Until then, remember that Odette Sansom's George Cross sits in a museum, but her nightmares persisted until her death in 1995, that medals commemorate courage but can't heal trauma, and that the truest honor we can give is acknowledging the full human cost of service, rather than celebrating only the achievements while ignoring the wounds. Thank you for watching, and never forget that behind every intelligent success were human beings who paid with pieces of themselves that they never got back, and that our obligation is to remember them completely, their courage and their suffering, their achievements and their scars. The decades following World War II revealed the full extent of espionage's psychological toll as agents who'd maintained silence during victory celebrations began breaking down in the isolation of peacetime. The 1950s and 1960s saw alarming patterns among SOE and OSS veterans, divorce rates exceeding 60%, alcoholism rates 3 times higher than the general population, and suicide rates that military historians estimate at twice the civilian average, though exact numbers remain classified even today. These weren't statistics the intelligence services advertised. They contradicted the heroic narratives that governments needed to maintain public support for Cold War intelligence operations, and they raised uncomfortable questions about whether nations adequately supported the people they sent into psychological danger. The specific mechanisms through which wartime espionage created lasting damage involved the intersection of multiple trauma types that conventional therapy wasn't equipped to address. Combat soldiers experienced fear-based trauma from life-threatening situations, but they could process those experiences within frameworks of duty, courage, and shared sacrifice that made meaning from suffering. Espionage agents experienced that same fear-based trauma, but with added layers: the isolation of working alone without unit support, the moral injury from deception and manipulation, the identity confusion from maintaining false personas, and the impossible burden of secrets they could never share. When Francis Camartz returned from running resistance networks in France, he couldn't tell his wife about the decisions he'd made that sent people to their deaths, couldn't explain why certain sounds triggered panic attacks, couldn't participate in veterans groups because his service remained classified. The result was progressive isolation, where the only people who understood were other agents, creating insular communities of the traumatized who could share experiences but who also reinforced each other's damage. The treatment approaches available in the 1940s and 1950s were primitive by modern standards and often actively harmful. Military psychiatry emphasized getting over it through willpower and forward focus, which invalidated agents' suffering and prevented processing. Freudian psychoanalysis, dominant in civilian psychiatry, interpreted trauma symptoms as manifestations of repressed childhood conflicts rather than as normal responses to abnormal experiences, wasting years on irrelevant treatment. Some agents were prescribed sedatives or alcohol to manage symptoms, creating dependencies that compounded rather than resolved psychological problems. Electroshock therapy was used in severe cases, causing memory loss that affected operational knowledge. Agents were still bound by secrecy laws not to reveal. The fundamental problem was that effective trauma treatment requires being able to discuss traumatic experiences in detail, but espionage agents were legally prohibited from discussing most of what had traumatized them, creating therapeutic impasse where healing required actions that could result in prosecution. The breakthrough in understanding and treating espionage trauma came gradually through several parallel developments. The Vietnam War produced another generation of traumatized veterans, but unlike WWII veterans, they returned to a society willing to acknowledge psychological damage, creating political pressure for better treatment that benefited all veterans, including aging espionage agents. The feminist movement of the 1970s connected combat trauma to domestic violence trauma, revealing common patterns and developing treatment approaches that worked for both. Cognitive behavioral therapy emerged as alternative to psychoanalysis, focusing on symptom management and cognitive restructuring rather than childhood exploration. And critically, declassification of WWII intelligence operations in the 1970s and 1980s allowed agents to finally discuss experiences that had been secret for decades, enabling therapeutic processing that had been impossible earlier. Odette Sansom's post-war life exemplified both the damage and the partial healing that characterize many agents' trajectories. After her 1995 ceremony honoring her wartime service, she became more public about her experiences, giving interviews and writing memoirs that helped her process trauma through narrative construction. But she also acknowledged limitations. Nightmares never fully ceased. Hypervigilance remained constant, and certain triggers, German accents, confined spaces, certain smells associated with Ravensbrück, could still precipitate panic attacks 50 years after liberation. She described her post-war self as fundamentally different from her pre-war self, as if Odette Brayley, who'd been a housewife in Somerset, had died in Ravensbrück, and someone else had emerged wearing her face. This sense of discontinuous identity, of the person before espionage being irretrievably lost, appears consistently in agent testimonies and represents one of espionage's most profound costs. The sacrifice isn't just years of service, but the very self that existed before. Modern intelligence agencies have learned from these failures, implementing comprehensive psychological support systems that WWII-era services lacked. Contemporary CIA, MI6, and other agencies provide pre-deployment psychological screening more sophisticated than WWII assessment, ongoing support from agency psychologists during operations, mandatory debrief and counseling after missions, and long-term mental health care for retired agents. The recognition that psychological fitness is as important as physical fitness, that psychological injury is as real as physical wounds, and that agencies have obligations to operators beyond operational success represents significant progress. But fundamental tensions remain. Espionage still requires deception that erodes identity, still demands moral compromises that create injury, still imposes secrecy that prevents normal processing. The question of whether psychological damage is acceptable cost for intelligence operations, or whether it indicates that operations should be redesigned to minimize that damage, remains contested. The cultural legacy of WWII espionage trauma extends beyond intelligence communities to broader conversations about secrets, sacrifice, and how societies honor service that can't be publicly acknowledged. The families of agents who died in service often didn't learn how they died for decades. Official records listed them as missing or killed in accidents, protecting operational security, but denying families closure and preventing proper grieving. Children grew up with fathers or mothers they never knew, unable to understand their parents' sacrifice because it remained classified. Spouses lived with partners whose psychological damage they couldn't understand, because the experiences that caused it couldn't be discussed. This imposed silence created intergenerational trauma patterns similar to those in Holocaust survivors and combat veterans. Children inheriting anxiety and hypervigilance from parents without understanding the source, learning that certain topics were forbidden, developing their own psychological symptoms in response to family emotional climate. The contemporary relevance extends to current intelligence operatives facing similar psychological challenges. CIA case officers running agents in hostile countries, NSA analysts monitoring terrorist communications, undercover officers infiltrating criminal organizations, all face psychological demands similar to WWII agents, even though technologies and threats have changed. The recognition that these psychological costs are inherent to intelligence work, rather than failures of individual weakness, has created more supportive organizational cultures, but it hasn't eliminated the costs. Modern intelligence agencies struggle with retention as operatives burn out from psychological stress, with ethical recruitment as they must honestly describe psychological risks to recruits, and with public accountability as they must balance operational security against transparency about how they treat personnel. So what do we ultimately take from examining WWII's espionage's invisible scars? We take the recognition that heroism has psychological prices that societies must acknowledge rather than romanticize, that medals commemorate courage but don't heal wounds, and that honoring service requires supporting survivors, not just celebrating sacrifices. We take the understanding that some experiences fundamentally change people in ways they can't reverse, that Odette and thousands like her gave not just years, but essential parts of themselves that they never recovered. We take the obligation to improve how we prepare, support, and care for people whose service requires psychological exposure, to create systems that minimize damage rather than accepting it as inevitable cost. We take the lesson that secrets compound trauma by preventing processing, that classification serving operational security can simultaneously prevent healing, and that finding balance between legitimate secrecy and therapeutic necessity remains an ongoing challenge. And we take inspiration from survivors who, despite carrying wounds they never fully healed, found ways to build meaningful post-war lives, to form relationships despite difficulty with trust, and to contribute to ensuring future generations of intelligence operatives receive better care than they did.